Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak here on behalf of Campaign Against Arms Trade. And thank you so much to everyone who's worked so hard to bring us all together today. We find ourselves at an especially perilous time with major wars, as we've heard, in Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East, more broadly, Sudan, and in, I think you said, Roger, over 100 conflicts around the world. And the calls for countries to rearm are growing louder, as if the $2 trillion the world spends annually on weapons and warfare did not lead us exactly to the position that we now find ourselves in, the violence of a collapsing colonial world order. Here in the UK, £18 billion is handed to arms companies every year. Money that should be spent on hospitals, on schools, on transport infrastructure, on greening our economy. Instead, it is used to build weapons that kill. And another £8 billion is spent by foreign governments buying British weapons, most of which comes from regimes in the Middle East who use those weapons to wage wars on their neighbours and to oppress their own citizens. The consequences are clear. In the Yemen war, over 277,000 people have died since the hostilities began in 2015, mainly of disease, starvation, and the destruction of medical facilities and water supplies. This is a war fueled by over £25 billion of armour sales to the Saudi-led coalition. And the uneasy truce brokered last year was broken by the UK, the US and Israel, who have repeatedly bombed Yemen again. And the UK continues to supply parts for the F-35 jets used by Israel, UK contribution being responsible for some 15% of each jet by value. This is a warplane that we know has been used against civilians in Gaza and against Iran and Yemen and very likely in Lebanon. The UK is not just engaging in the genocide in Gaza, it is profiting from it. Okay, I'm not sure if people can hear me over that. Okay. It seems somewhat fitting almost. Horrific though these examples are, we must also remember that many of the weapons flooding into conflict zones are not single-use. They're not bombs that are dropped that cause their damage. They're weapons that are used time and time again, and they pose a risk beyond the conflict they were originally licensed for. The countries of former Yugoslavia still face an ongoing challenge of dealing with criminal gangs who have ready access to military-grade weaponry that was not properly decommissioned at the end of the wars there at the end of the last century. And while the death and destruction in Ukraine continues, it might seem premature to talk about the post-conflict situation. But the huge volume of weaponry that has been pumped into that country by both sides creates a huge challenge for rebuilding peace once the fighting stops. There is, though, evidence that we can choose another way, that we can build peace in our international community. For centuries, the people of these islands have feared invasion by France and vice versa. And twice in the last century, this country was at war with Germany. But today, we do not fear invasion from France. We don't fear invasion from Germany. And that's not because the UK is better armed. It's because we've spent decades building peaceful international relations, codifying those into international institutions. So as we gather to remember all of those who've perished in wars, let us ask ourselves what we can do for peace and justice. Let's talk to our friends and our neighbours and urge them to take whatever steps they can to end this global violence. It might be sitting in front of the tanks. It might be painting a protest sign. It might be writing to your MP. It might be remembering the stories you've heard today and telling them to people who aren't here today. So let us work together to make real the promise of the original Armistice Day, that of never again. Let us honour the lives of so many who have been lost in war by making sure that no more lives are lost in future wars. And let us have a world where peace and justice prevails over conflict and violence. Thank you.